Imagine, 2,000 years from now, technology has advanced a great deal, and humanity knows a lot that we didn't in 2023. Yet many are convinced that researchers are nearing a major breakthrough in discovering the fabled Emerald City in the lost land of Oz. This might sound absurd to us because in 2023, we know that Oz and the Emerald City are the fictional creation of one L. Frank Baum. But the situation looks very similar to those of us who study the ancient Greeks when we see the Seekers of Atlantis, the fictional creation of the philosopher Plato. So what's the problem? Why does it matter if we hold false ideas about the past? Because how we see the past informs how we interpret the present, and sometimes even how we shape the future. The story of Atlantis is told in two works by the philosopher Plato, written in the 4th century BCE, the Timaeus and the Critias. Platonic dialogues are fictional conversations between his teacher Socrates and various historical figures, some of whom weren't even alive at the same time as Socrates or each other. But the point is that Socrates asks a bunch of questions to show that their belief system is inconsistent. You know, philosopher stuff. The story of Atlantis follows the Republic, a lengthy discussion of what an ideal state could look like. In Timaeus, Socrates asks if any of his companions can tell an interesting story that might help illuminate us as to how this ideal state they just imagined would conduct foreign policy. Critias tells a story. It's a heck of a story. In his story, the ideal state is embodied in a reimagining of ancient Athens. They stand against the Goliath of imperialism, but it's not history that the characters and the audience would have known, for example, the Persian Wars. Instead, he tells a brand new story that purports to be 9,000 years old. In his story, Atlantis is a continent-sized island in the Atlantic Ocean. It's blessed with an abundance of every kind, and its people are the lucky descendants of the god Poseidon. But over time, Atlantis becomes greedy and warlike and builds an empire as far east as Italy and Egypt. In the story, the Athenians rally the Greeks against their would-be conquerors. And against all odds, the ideal state holds its own. The gods decide that Atlantis has become debased and oppressive. After a series of earthquakes, it sinks into the sea. The dialogues are the first place anywhere where we have a mention of Atlantis. There are simply no sources before Plato decided to put this story into the mouth of his fictionalized Critias. Even his star student, Aristotle, must have known the story in depth, but he didn't include it in any of his own work, even when he was talking about the geographical area where it was said to have been. For him, the destruction of Atlantis seemed a necessary writer's device to explain why no one had ever seen or heard of the place. There simply was no Atlantis before Plato, in the same way there was no Mickey Mouse before Walt Disney and Ub Iwerks. Historians of the ancient world and specialists in Greek texts are nearly unanimous. Atlantis is fiction, not history. So why do so many believe in it? That's an important story to unravel. Nearly 2,000 years later, Europeans sailed west and bumped into two continents they didn't know were there. But they hadn't discovered anything. These continents and the islands surrounding them were full of people with their own cultures as complex as anything that was going on in Europe. As their project of exploration changed to one of colonization, they were amazed at the architectural wonders that they saw in these places. But with an inflexible worldview on one hand and economic incentive not to extend human rights to those they were colonizing on the other, they decided that there was no way these structures were built by the inhabitants. Instead, they assumed they must have been made by someone who was already in their history. So the next couple centuries, the architectural wonders of the Americas were attributed to lost tribes of Israel, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Vikings, and Atlanteans. Since then, space aliens have joined the party. But in many ways, Atlanteans were the first. I like to call them conveniently disappearing white people, because although no one's ever seen anyone from Atlantis, the lion's share of what's been created in terms of film and literature about them shows them very much like white Europeans, a point we'll come back to. The idea of Atlantis as a real place reached a fever pitch with what's been called the most influential work of pseudoscience. In 1882, US Congressman Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In it, he tried to reconcile the destruction of Atlantis with a literal interpretation of the biblical flood in Genesis. He also popularized the idea that Atlantis was the cultural source of the Mayan civilization, the Egyptian civilization, and numerous others. And then he said that Atlantis was the homeland of what he described as the blue-eyed Aryan race. Donnelly's work inspired a lot of imitators. Today, the idea of Atlantis or lost civilizations described similarly, but perhaps not called Atlantis, is big business. There's no shortage of books or television shows exploring the idea that real civilizations were built on the knowledge of these fictional Atlanteans. They usually depend on an idea I like to call places of mystery. I noticed even as a child watching these programs that if you mapped out these mysterious places, they're not distributed evenly throughout the world. Rather, they center on Africa, the Americas, and occasionally some parts of Asia. It's very rare to see the trope invoked in Europe, with the main and constant exception being Stonehenge. I've never, in my whole life, I don't remember ever seeing a show suggesting that the Parthenon, the Colosseum, or any Gothic cathedral was built by aliens or refugees from Atlantis. But I've seen it used many times about structures and sites that are actually very well documented by their builders, so long as they weren't European. So, where's the harm? Well, I've already mentioned that these sites aren't distributed evenly throughout the world, but they've often been, the idea of mystery sites has been weaponized to separate people from their cultural heritage. When you separate someone from their cultural heritage, it's much easier not to see them as a fully actualized human with a working culture that doesn't need any help from you. Instead, you might see them as what colonizers might call worthless savages as a justification to subjugate and exploit them. Unfortunately, it gets worse. Donnelly's ideas in the next few decades greatly appealed to those who wanted to promote the idea that Germanic peoples were superior. A coffee baron paid for this building to be built in Bremen. The building's called Atlantis House. Its upper floor, they called the Heaven Hall. It was decorated to evoke the notion of Atlantis. And it was inscribed with the names of figures from Germanic myth and history, culminating in Adolf Hitler. Nazis believed that they were descended from the blood of Atlantis and used this to justify their notion of racial superiority. In their retelling of the story, those descendants of Poseidon, those godlike Atlanteans, were Germans. And after the destruction of the island, they spread out over the world, founding all the other cultures and fueling their achievements. In this revisionist framework, you might be led to believe that Donnelly's and Hitler's Aryans were responsible for everything, everywhere. It was so important to Heinrich Himmler that he made it part of the culture of the SS and founded what he called the Ancestral Heritage Group to study and teach it. Atlantis had gone from what was originally a parable to part of the intellectual framework used to support genocide. We may wonder, given the history, why the idea of Atlantis is still so popular. This kind of pseudoscience catches on because presenters take their audience on a journey. They make us feel like we know a secret, and there's some fun, perhaps, in thinking that we know something that the experts don't want us to know. Which is actually hilarious, because if there was a shred of evidence, archaeologists like myself would be tripping over each other trying to publish it before any of the others. We're a little competitive. But there are a number of other things that make it popular too. Donnelly's ideas were picked up by New Age figures like Madame Blavatsky and never entirely went away. So viewers see these shows on television and the ideas are vaguely familiar. There's sort of a déjà vu feeling. The authors and the showrunners leverage holes in the education of the public. Information that doesn't support their narrative, they omit entirely. Facts that are known are often treated as if they are unknowable mysteries. And there's another technique they use. That's the leading question. Is it possible that TEDx is an ancient technology introduced by refugees fleeing the destruction of their homeland in Atlantis? No. I watch way more of these shows than I would prefer to, out of a sense of professional responsibility to know what the public is learning, what my current and future students might be learning by watching them. And when I'm presented with this kind of leading question, which is almost always on a question that doesn't stand up to rational scrutiny, like the one I just asked, I find it's important to say, no. Come on, no. Because if you let it hang out there as a rhetorical question, it allows an idea that doesn't make any sense when you think about it to gain a foothold in your brain. And that's not something we want. Let's think about Atlantis the way it was intended to be, as a fable or a parable, a warning that a powerful state can become warlike and imperialist, and a hope that an ideal society could defend itself from such aggression. This was clear to the ancient audience. No one read through Aesop's fables and then ran around the forest looking for talking foxes. No one read about the famous cave mentioned in the Republic and said, hey, where's that cave? I'd like to visit that someday. Because we understand that it's an allegory. Atlantis, too, should be seen as a hypothetical concept made to test a philosophical notion. And we know the dark turn things can take when people treat fable as history. Next time we're presented with a claim that people of the past owe their cultural achievements to Atlantis, some lost civilization that no one can find, or even ancient aliens, I'd like us to think more carefully about what information has been presented to us and what has been omitted. The heroes in Plato's story, or rather Critias' story, are the Athenians. As a representation of an ideal state, they hold their own against an enormous evil empire and survive. Historically, those who have twisted the tale of Atlantis to their own ends have behaved not like them, but as greedy, despotic Atlantis. And how did that turn out for them? Thank you.